Um, yeah, okay, recording in progress. Welcome everyone, as James said, to a very special iteration of the TANF redesign meeting. I'd like to, Mara, how do you say your last name?
Hennigan.
Yeah, I'm really happy to introduce Mara Hennigan, who's the senior strategist at the Economic Security Project, which is an organization that's leading a national conversation on guaranteed basic income. And Mara, I'll kick it to you soon, but just wanted to kind of give everyone that Mara will be giving us kind of a broad overview about the intersection of guaranteed income and other public benefits and strategies for policymakers, program administrators, and oh, this is being recorded. Great. Good day to stumble over words. As well as talking a little bit about the learning memo that was released, I think, in March. So Mara, thank you so much for joining Oregon today. And please, I leave it to you.
Thanks so much, Jen. And thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to get to share this work. We kind of, I'll get into it in the presentation, but are having this conversation with a lot of different states and jurisdictions, and really trying to make sure that the role we can play is to share our learnings with everybody and then share your experience with others. So we're able to work on this at the state level and also at the national level when appropriate. So I'm going to pull up some slides here. I guess before I do that, oh, can someone make me a co-host so I can screen share if possible? Oh, I think that will work now. But before I do that, just my own introduction. Like Jen said, I'm Mara Hennigan. I'm a senior strategist with Economic Security Project based in Chicago. And before joining ESP, I actually was director of policy for Cook County, which is the county where Chicago's based. So also I'm very familiar with the kind of government implementation side of these questions and the big policy strategy side of these questions, and really excited to be in a policy focused space today and get to kind of think through how we protect benefits for folks from many vantage points within this system. So with that, I will screen share here. Are folks seeing the regular version or the presenter version?
I think we can see the version you want us to see, so we don't see your notes or anything.
Perfect. So we can move through to the next slide. So just a little bit of a kind of overview here on who Economic Security Project is. We are an issues advocacy organization with a national focus, but very deep state level and local level partnerships. And we advocate for ideas that are primed to advance our vision. We're an economy where we thrive, where everyone can thrive. We think about this as guaranteed income, which provides an income floor for all Americans. And we're using the term Americans to mean people within the US in this context. And then we also have an anti-monopoly action team that is thinking about the structural changes needed to end the constrained economy due to kind of accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a very few. So we see these fights as really intertwined, and the guaranteed income push is getting resources to folks we know need it, and the anti-monopoly push is really making sure that the systems we have in place are set up to allow our whole economy to thrive. For guaranteed income terms and definitions, ESP is a co-convener along with Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, the University of Pennsylvania's Guaranteed Income Lab, and a few other folks. We are the co-convener of the National Community of Practice, and Madeline Niley, who's our Director of Guaranteed Income, co-chairs that, along with Dr. Aisha Nyandaro of Springboard to Opportunities. And that group is about, and I know some of you are members of it, the group is at this point, I think 420 folks from across the country working in all different parts of this ecosystem. And together we've collectively kind of adopted this shared definition of guaranteed income to mean regular cash payments that are accessible to members of a community with no strings attached and no work requirements. So I think many of you will kind of know that there are plenty of other versions of cash transfer programs that might have slightly different definitions. There's also things like universal basic income, which would have a different definition as well. But just wanted to ground us in kind of the way that ESP talks about guaranteed income, and also that the GICP has chosen to talk about guaranteed income. And then to really focus, I think, in our conversation today on the fact that we see guaranteed income as building a robust floor under which no one can fall. And so we think that that is supplementing existing structures, not supplanting them. And we really firmly believe that the existing social safety net is necessary but insufficient. And that is, I think, in contrast to some other proposals that are similar in nature to providing direct cash, but might have different end goals overall. And we ground guaranteed income in the values of trust and respect for recipients, and really see that those as kind of fundamental shifts in how government is administering support to its residents. And we champion guaranteed income as a means of ending poverty, reducing social inequalities, and promoting gender and racial equity. I touched on this a little bit, but when we talk about guaranteed income, we are thinking about trust, deservedness, and autonomy. Cash is grounded in trust and respect for recipients. It also challenges deeply held beliefs that are rooted in racism and sexism over who deserves government support, who deserves kind of these basic access to basic necessities, and then also how people deserve to be able to make decisions about their own lives, which I think gets us to the autonomy piece. We've seen from the evidence that cash provides opportunities for risk-taking and choice that allow people to best fit the benefit we're providing to their specific needs. And then just to lift up that the fight for guaranteed income is grounded in racial, gender, and economic justice. In 1967, Dr. King called for guaranteed income as one of his last published works. Johnny Tillman, an organizer with the National Welfare Rights Organization, and actually pushed him to make that call for guaranteed income and adopted that as part of the welfare rights organizing work she was doing in the 1970s. The Black Panthers called for it as part of their 10-point program in 1966. And so we really see ourselves as building on this legacy and wanting to center those calls as we call for a federal guaranteed income currently. So I think that's kind of my very broad guaranteed income overview. Happy to get into any specifics, but I think today, some of the challenges we were kind of talking about that are relevant for the work you all are doing together is thinking about how we protect benefits for guaranteed income recipients currently, and then thinking more structurally how we are designing systems that are accessible and equitable for benefits overall, as well as for future guaranteed income policy. Why prioritize protecting public benefits? I think this is a question I know that for folks implementing, especially in the design phase of programs, we get asked a lot, and not from a place of not kind of understanding, but there is so much work to do when you are lifting up these systems, when you are setting up these programs. And we really want to make the case that prioritizing benefits is an essential part of program design, especially as we are seeing programs that are launching with much larger target areas than we used to see. So before we would have maybe 20, 30 participants in a demonstration, and there are some creative solutions you can do in those instances that aren't going to make sense when you are at hundreds or even thousands of participants, like we know many of our publicly funded pilots are. So prioritizing protecting public benefits increases support. Existing programs, like I said, we view them as existing public programs, are necessary but insufficient. And if guaranteed income is meant to supplement the social safety net, we need that to be true in the demonstrations we're running, because most of these demonstrations have at least some portion of the goal is to build the evidence and build the case for why we need this to be institutionalized in policy. And if we are running demonstrations that can't include everybody, we are inherently baking inequity into the future policy making we'll do with the learnings from these demonstrations. That gets to the promote equity side. If we don't focus on protecting public benefits, participants who typically receive those benefits might get less money overall from the guaranteed income program if they have to sub in some of that guaranteed income for the benefit they might lose. It also might mean that the cost of participation may be too high for many folks. So people with disabilities often can't participate currently because we are worried about jeopardizing any type of SSI benefits they might be receiving. Those benefits we know are really tricky to navigate. If you kind of lose access, it is really hard to get access again, versus some programs potentially like SNAP, where it is common for people to be cycling in and out of those systems. And so if we take the disability example, that means we are not moving from a disability justice lens, and we are often excluding folks with disabilities from participating in the pilots. because the benefit is just not high enough for them. And going back to my previous example, that means that our learnings are not going to cover kind of the broadest swath of the population that we can. And that kind of brings us into improving learnings. And so we really, for demonstrations, think about how we're using that knowledge to champion a guaranteed income or cash policies, or just a more accessible social safety net system overall. And we really want to make sure that at this foundational stage of the movement, we are including everybody and we are thinking as intentionally as possible about this work. So I mentioned the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice, which is the GICP. I would say in May 2021, as part of that kind of the regular convenings, we had a meeting about the benefits cliff, which I'm sure many of you know, but for folks who are not familiar with that term, the benefits cliff is where somebody earns enough income or has enough assets, they begin to lose eligibility for a benefit that they might already have, like SNAP, for example, but they are not making enough income or they do not have enough assets to actually kind of afford whatever that benefit was meant to cover in the regular marketplace. And so maybe your SNAP benefit is decreasing because you got a promotion at work, and so your wages are a little bit higher, but that's not actually enough to cover what you need to have food security. And so you're kind of hitting this cliff and you're dropping off on the benefit side of things, and there's nothing, whatever is there to catch you as you kind of go over that cliff is not sufficient to meet your need. And we see this in plenty of programs where, and we know that this is how that people make decisions about participating in programs very intentionally based on where they are currently falling in that income spectrum and whether they're nearing the benefits cliff. So there are people who are really aware of that, and there are also people in programs who may not be as aware, and we need to think about catering to both so that we're able to involve everyone. So the National Guaranteed Income Community of Practice had this meeting on the benefits cliff and really decided to form a smaller working group to think about federal benefits protection. At the time, we were focused on federal because we want to think about equity across the country, and that's kind of part of where the guaranteed income team sits, is really trying to make these connections for folks working in states and local jurisdictions all over. And what we're seeing is that there are some states that are more amenable to protecting benefits than others, which means that we are, as demonstrations start popping up in many places, we are seeing differences in the access to benefits protection folks in those programs are getting. So for example, we have Magnolia Mothers Trust runs a program for Black women in subsidized housing, Black mothers in subsidized housing in Jackson, Mississippi. And they've been running that program since 2018 and have not really been able to secure waivers. And they figured that Mississippi would not be as supportive as some other states have been. But that means that then the folks in the Chicago or Cook County pilots have access to that protection in a way folks in the Jackson, Mississippi pilot don't. And we kind of wanted to take a federal lens and think about what we can do that would protect people overall. The GICP's approach was that wherever possible over the long term, our goal is to protect federal benefits through federal legislation, because we know that that is the most permanent and long-lasting protection we can put in place. When, and kind of in a more immediate fashion, if there are avenues for pursuing non-legislative federal action that can provide protection more quickly, that is kind of our second tier priority. And then the guidance for states and local governments where a federal fix is not effective or adequate, or frankly will take too long for folks in existing pilots. We're developing resources and informational materials and having conversations like this one to talk about how we are able to provide that immediate support, especially in places that are kind of amenable and proactively thinking about this. I'll talk through more of the memo itself, but just so when I send around the slides, you'll have the link to the memo there too. But from that work in March of this year, we published this learning memo detailing partially our process for how we started thinking about these things, and then also some initial findings. One of our first findings is that we have to be really intentional as we're designing the existing demonstrations. And that's, at the time we were starting this conversation, some of the kind of larger public programs that have since launched were in the works, but many weren't. And so the examples we had were mostly smaller, privately funded pilots. One of the first things that that's important to think through as we design programs are the funding source. So private and public funding can implicate different benefits very differently. And that kind of gets into the payment structure side of things if we're structuring it as a gift versus income. But just want to kind of clarify that the funding source that we're thinking of, and I don't know, I guess for folks in the room here, which of those feels more resonant, and we can talk through in more depth if there's kind of things that come up for the group. But I can say from the public funding side of things, when I was with Cook County, the SNAP protections we had were preferential to private funding. And I know that a couple other jurisdictions have done this where they've pursued some amount of private funding, and that then protects you from implicating SNAP for the full population of participants in your program. And there were questions as we started digging into that, like, did you have to set aside separate money, and anyone who received SNAP had to get paid out of that pot versus another pot? We've had a lot of success with USDA, and so we've been able to have kind of some very clear guidance, and I can share that memo with folks. But just want to say that SNAP is one example where the funding source really does change the level of protection participants would have. The payment structure is another where the kind of IRS definition of gifts is often helpful for protecting benefits, but so for Magnolia Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi, they structure it as income so that they're helping their participants become eligible for the EITC. And so there are plenty of considerations where structuring it as income might actually kind of support access to benefits. And that's something that I think really depends on your population, depends on the context you're working within, and then depends on kind of your funding source and the restrictions of the organization that's running the program. And then payment frequency is another one where often if an income is defined as regular and predictable. And so the switch, I think we can get into some tax credit conversations too, but the child tax credit is a really good example where under the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal government created the option of receiving monthly payments. When the federal government does that with a tax credit, it is not a problem. When state and local governments do it, the current statute is silent on whether that kind of starts to implicate benefits. And so that's an area we are really trying to think through. But I just want to flag here that the predictability in many different contexts is kind of where you start to get into, where you might, if you're designing a program, start to have to kind of get legal opinions or work with a state agency to understand if they feel like they can kind of take that monthly payment for a time limited program and count that as still a gift or still not as predictable as like traditional income. With all those considerations in mind, we have some harm reduction strategies for implementers specifically. And I think I'm using that word to mean folks implementing from a nonprofit side or a government side. I think really it's if you're in the program design phase of a demonstration. I think the kind of biggest bang for your buck is pursuing waivers and exemptions, especially if you are in a state where you have folks on this call who are kind of actively thinking about benefits protection and access. I'm also, again, coming from a context that we have a pretty supportive state legislature, a pretty supportive state executive branch, and we've been able to secure a lot of waivers and exemptions that have made us have to do less of numbers 2 and 3 here, and have just given us certainty and a very clear way to talk with our participants so that they fully understand kind of all of the work going into protecting benefits. And then they also have letters from like our Department of Human Services that say this person is exempt, that they can bring to any kind of meeting they might have to go to, or that they have proof that their benefit is protected from the state level. But the second is providing benefits counseling pre-enrollment and post-program. So again, we recommend this strategy for all types of pilots and demonstrations. And what this can do is as folks are enrolling in the program, a benefits counselor is working through with them to make sure they've provided all necessary documentation to really have that protection. And then also they really proactively understand how any benefits might be changing. And then a post-program, which I think is less talked about, partially because we don't have as many folks at the post-program level yet, but post-program helping people re-enroll if they are rolling off a guaranteed income program and may now again be eligible for benefits they've lost access to. And then depending on the size of your program or the needs of the folks you're serving, considering creating a hold harmless fund, which is essentially a fund that you program implementers would then use to make up the difference of any benefits that might be lost. And again, if you're serving 1,000 people in your program, this might look much different than if you're serving 30, or if you have a bunch of waivers in place and this is kind of an emergency scenario for you, versus if you're in a state where you know you're not getting that many waivers, and so you expect the cost of what you would need in a hold harmless fund to be much higher. Any immediate questions there, and if not, I'm gonna move to the policymaker side, and we can always dig into this more in the Q&A. All right. So that was the implementer side. The policymaker side is working to protect public benefits through a couple different avenues. The first is if you're in a position to support waivers and exemptions. Obviously, that's a structural way that we can guarantee all programs operating in a jurisdiction are able to kind of receive similar protections. We've seen this work very well when kind of supportive folks on the government side are involved in these conversations earlier, because we know that this takes time to clear through various agencies. And then we've also seen a lot of kind of differences in where we're able to get support. So one example is that in New York, I think that their TANF support, the first level of TANF support that they got was because one program specifically, Baby's First Years, was funding this study to understand how it was changing kind of child development. And they were able to use the state legislature's support for some child development research as like justification for why this would be an important learning for the state and why this would be useful to future policy making. And so there's some creative strategies that I think are necessarily going to happen in a local context, and ESP is definitely here to support those, but also lean on your expertise of what you all know about your context. But in the short term, waivers and exemptions have been really useful and can often be the fastest if the executive branch is on board and is prepared and has the necessary support they need from implementers, but also from the federal government for certain programs. And so one thing we are doing is putting together, we've kind of compiled the resources we have on this. So we've compiled existing exemptions that different agencies have granted and the language that the pilots who got those waivers or exemptions used to make those asks, because we think often that's going to be applicable across different areas. And that will be we'll be pushing that out to the GICP in the middle of next month. So very excited to have that to share with you all. Also, we've seen states, including Illinois, New York, and California, push policy through their state legislatures to kind of set the precedent for exempting this, exempting guaranteed income from any state benefits. So Illinois, for example, Illinois' policy is that for any person receiving guaranteed income that has some type of kind of research tied to it, it doesn't have to necessarily be an RCT, it doesn't have to necessarily be strictly quantitative research, but it has to have a learning component. If it is tied to that, we then have exemptions for all of the benefits that the state controls. And so that still requires a lot of very close partnership with all of those different agencies to make sure that people within those agencies have exactly what they need to document that. But it at least helps us say, no, look, the state legislature is supportive, the governor was supportive, and we just need to figure out how to implement. And we've seen that really clear the way of some of the bureaucracy we can otherwise, we know that it kind of would otherwise take to get those same protections. And then acting in coordination. And this is a place where ESP is really trying to support the movement, because we know that at the state level, there's going to be questions that then need to go up to a federal agency. And we've started to see that when you're working with a regional administrator, some regional administrators are supportive and others are not. And this is another place where discretion is coming into the decision making in a way that can create inequities across different areas. And so we are trying to understand who is getting what types of protections, and then how we can help make the case at a more national level to say, it doesn't really make sense, you know, if we're all operating from the same USDA kind of guidance, it wouldn't make sense that the Midwest has all these protections and the Southwest doesn't, for example. And we've seen that start to work. And so we have some, that was kind of exactly the situation that ended up with many champions from New Mexico and Illinois pushing for this SNAP protection we recently received. And we have the language that USDA sent to all regional administrators that provides protections. And so we really want to help different states act in coordination when they are moving up to the kind of federal level versus anything under their jurisdiction. This is supposed to have the links to these bills in here, so I'll make sure it does before I send it around in case it's helpful to see the language that different states are using. And then we also have a report from the Shriver Center on Poverty Law and Economic Security Project called States Lead the Way. And this starts to get at some very specific benefits about what states can consider as they set up different programs, including tax credit expansions, including dividend funds like we see in Alaska or with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. So there's a lot of ways to structure some of these programs, and kind of just want to shout out that report as a really helpful way to think about how different overall program structures can really shift some of these conversations, and happy to dig in more to that in the time we have. The other thing I just wanted to very quickly mention, and this is a little bit on the same train of thought, is we are starting to kind of make the case from the pathway to tax credits to a guaranteed income. We talk about the child tax credit as guaranteed income for households with kids. I think there's a lot of programs that are close to guaranteed income that we often just think of as separate. And so really we see a big link, both in terms of how these programs function and in terms of the agency they provide people, but also in terms of how the opportunities for expansion of cash programs to broader populations. And so just some differences here. And then again, this is talking about federal EITC, federal CTC, and then ARPA CTC, which was the expansion that was in place from July 2021 to December 2021. And then what we talk about when we say guaranteed income. You all might recognize some wins here, some recent cash wins in states. Again, just showing some of the momentum. And I think more than anything from ESP's perspective, we want to link these fights because we see so much of the same work going into them and so many of the same challenges on the implementation side, and really want to make sure we're having conversations that support pushes for tax credit expansions and protections for folks in guaranteed income demonstrations. Again, we can get into this, and ESP has a campaigns team that has a lot of really good thinking on benefits, access, and equity. And I know many of you have been in conversation with some of those folks. Happy to make those connections. But at a very high level, things that we think are needed to make overall benefit systems more accessible and equitable, which would include the tax credit expansions that may be a pathway to guaranteed income, are better tools and systems so that folks on the government side are able to make these connections, and that folks who have to file their taxes are able to do that in a kind of logical and easy and accessible way. A more inclusive eligibility and credit structure. So again, we support kind of programs that have as few requirements to eligibility as possible. Guaranteed income, like I said, we don't view it as having work requirements. The income thresholds, we've seen that kind of lower income thresholds obviously will make more people eligible. So happy to dig in there. And then effective outreach and support. I think one of the places where we see a lot of quick access or low-hanging fruit is some of the clinics to help with tax preparation, or when we had large pushes of state coalitions to get folks to claim their EITC or their CTC when benefits were shifting. And that work takes a broad group of people, but is helping people access benefits they are already owed. And we really see that as essential, and thinking about from an institutional perspective, how we continue to support that outreach and support that we know folks on the ground are doing to get money out to their communities. So more information is at our GICP website, and you can also sign up to join the GICP. Everyone is welcome, and it meets monthly. These are also some resources that we've put together. Again, the GICP website is there. We have a memo on some of the links between these benefit systems and hunger. This was specifically prepared for the White House's Conference on Hunger, Health, and Nutrition happening next week. And then the States Lead the Way report is linked here, and our learning memo. And these are two folks on the Guaranteed Income team you can contact with questions. I'm going to end the deck here for a minute. We can talk through more specific benefits or kind of any questions on this, but I figured it might be helpful if we can all see each other to do that. Any initial questions?
Well, Mara, sort of a housekeeping question. I understand you have to leave pretty shortly. Is that correct?
Yes, I am doing a fellowship abroad for about 9 months. So I will be leaving October 3rd from ESP, and then I will be they will know where to find me. I'm still plugged into the work, but I will not be working full time for them for a little bit. And so Madeline and Shafika will both be great stewards of this benefits work. I guess if I can ask you all a question then, I'm curious where these conversations are in some of your work. And so do you see, as you see folks maybe pursuing guaranteed income programs, is this top of mind for them? And then as you think about kind of policy fights as a coalition or as a group you might all have, is this benefits and access work kind of already part of the conversation, or does it feel like something you all are moving towards?
All right, I can't. I was trying to be polite and let other people go first, but so we are having a lot of conversations, and there are a lot of conversations happening at various tables within the state. And I think, and I'll let some of my community partners kind of weigh in on this, and also my colleague Sochi, who is doing who is part of a basic income pilot for youth experiencing homelessness. But I think, it is coming up again and again in a legislative environment, which has not historically been true in my memory. So I think that there are a lot of conversations happening in various spaces, but with respect to like the role I play, so I work for ODHS, which is the administrator of a lot of the federal benefits that we're talking about. Absolutely interested in looking at ways in which we hold people harmless, because I think the benefits cliff is, the most nefarious work of art that I've ever seen, probably. And I think that traditionally we haven't had a really good answer for that. So very interested in learning how, as we support these efforts to hold families harmless, especially on that side. Yeah, Patty.
So just building on that, one thing that's come up in the TANF redesign group is thinking about how, as we look to internally, both by policy and legislation, change how the TANF program runs in Oregon, how do we help align it with the idea of guaranteed income? Are there ways we can simplify it, smooth things out so it's not such a barrier for folks and lines up? And what I'm hearing you say is there are a million different ways to do guaranteed income and all sorts of pilots going on. But to me, that's one piece, since we're doing the redesign work together, advocates and the state partners together, are there some considerations that you might have or resources you might point us to help us, or is somebody else doing this work of trying to simplify TANF to align it more with what's going on the basic income side as well?
Absolutely. I think I'm going to drop the link for the Shriver report here, because I think some of that will be useful. But my kind of overall or high level recommendation is that we've found TANF has been, in addition to protecting kind of the TANF benefit, if you include the protection within your state option plan for SNAP, we've found basically we've been able to use TANF as a backdoor to protecting SNAP before we had full protection from USDA. And so also thinking about, I think there's the initial, as you do the TANF redesign and you're thinking about income and asset eligibility criteria there and how you might have discretion to exempt some of this type of support. Also thinking about what other programs are using TANF eligibility that you can then, you are simplifying, by simplifying TANF, you are simplifying those other programs. And by changing by lowering the income and asset eligibility or exempting, for instance, so like I said, Illinois exempts guaranteed income from demonstrations that have a learning component. And I can send you the language that's a state law. They ran it, I think like 3 years ago, maybe. And that language has worked really well for us. So there's folks I can connect you with to talk through what that looked like, but also that has been really helpful to then say these other programs that are pulling that TANF eligibility can substitute eligibility for, we've now inherently simplified those. And thinking about where TANF is linking to other benefit systems, I think can be really helpful to not duplicating your work.
I have a selfish question about housing since that's my more my interest area. So I read through the learning memo and amazing information about some of the things that the GACP is pursuing with HUD to address some of the barriers for exemptions and waivers. It seems like HUD is one of the stickiest federal agencies to work with on this. And so I'm curious if there's been any progress or updates since that learning memo was published. Like, is there interest at the HUD level to kind of have this conversation? And then I also have, if you can just briefly describe how a hold harmless fund might work, because in my head, it could be a vicious cycle where you're then giving people even more income that then is also increasing their rent to an even greater extent.
Absolutely. On the housing side, so for folks who maybe are not as deep in the memo, we had conversations with a program running, there was a program running that had participants in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which meant that their participants were actually living in about 7 different housing authority jurisdictions. And so in other instances, programs had just approached the housing authority and tried to work directly with that authority. And some housing authorities are part of a move to work program that we've seen have a little bit more discretion over kind of allowing folks to, or allowing the authority to exempt guaranteed income payments. As we started having programs that are running across multiple jurisdictions, especially in multiple states, that was not going to be a kind of feasible option to even have 8 different conversations there, let alone to ensure benefits to ensure that everyone would have the same decision. And so they began pursuing conversations with HUD and just trying to explore if there was appetite there. And I would say we've had appetite for the conversations, and then HUD is in some strategy conversations that they have told us they won't make kind of broader decisions on guaranteed income exemptions until they get through some of these kind of planning conversations that they're in. And so from a policy perspective, we have not really kind of made a lot of headway there, which means that housing authorities that are part of a Move to Work program, we kind of have seen good success of them giving exemptions. So Chicago Housing Authority is one. And then housing authorities that are not, which includes the Cook County Housing Authority, which is essentially half of the county is in CHA and half is in HAC, which is the Housing Authority of Cook County. Those folks have different protections. And again, that's long-term, the situation we are trying to avoid. Short-term, we have been able to find protections for Move to Work folks. And I'm happy to find language if that would be helpful. And then I think the next step will be waiting for HUD's timeline and then potentially, trying to do some advocacy if we don't get a lot of momentum on that. And then the Hold Harmless Fund. I think partially it was easier to, the Hold Harmless Fund supplement is easier to structure as a gift because it is a one-time, or you can structure it as a one-time payment. It also potentially is easier if you have if you are running a publicly funded program and the public funding is jeopardizing benefits, the Hold Harmless Fund and running a Hold Harmless Fund that has private funding can sometimes that will be counted differently. So I think your point about the revolving nature of continuously providing more benefits to make up for benefits people are losing, and that inching everyone closer to the benefits cliff conceptually is true. And then it's all of these technicalities within the programs that sometimes allows the Hold Harmless Fund to be more supportive. But again, it's not, I think the bigger the pilot, the harder it is to figure out how to make a kind of all-encompassing Hold Harmless Fund. And so Stockton, so the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration in Stockton, California, also known as SEED, which was the first mayor-led demonstration in the country. They had a Hold Harmless Fund, and they ended up running the program for 2 years. Cook County is not going to have a Hold Harmless Fund because we're going to have 3,250 participants over 2 years. And we were able to get more waivers than Stockton did, partially because of the work Stockton and Magnolia Mothers Trust and others have shown about kind of the initial proof of concept. But I know that Magnolia Mothers Trust still has a Hold Harmless Fund. There are places that are using it. I think it just kind of is population dependent and context specific. And then also I know that as programs get bigger and folks that have Hold Harmless Funds are really having to be intentional about how they're marketing that to participants, because it might not cover all benefits everyone's losing, but you might decide like housing, we want to cover housing benefits, absolutely. So there's, I think, a lot of considerations within the Hold Harmless Fund itself, and the larger the population you're trying to support is, the more that kind of process is going to come into play, so that you are making sure that those decisions are made ahead of time, that folks don't expect money that isn't there, and also from the administrative side, that you're not all of a sudden having to decide like, are we supporting this person lost this type of benefit, this person lost this type of benefit, and we only have so much resources. So how are we navigating that? James' point here about the source of the fund is a part I find particularly mind-boggling too, especially for like with SNAP, basically it's at this point, if you have any private funding, we can count it as we've gotten permission to not, that it doesn't then be strictly publicly funded, which is like, it's not even a proportion or, covering a specific number of people. And so the mind-bogglingness continues even as we start to get around some of these things. Patty?
This just sort of gets my head spinning, because we have so many programs with so many different rules and regulations and so many layers of bureaucracy. And wow, wouldn't it be great if instead of having to seek waivers for all this stuff, we could actually have a demonstration project that rolled all that money into one, got rid of all the rules and regulations, and just help families succeed. It's crazy.
I know, I think that these conversations really do ask us to think about how we view our public benefit system and how we want to, as folks who kind of are in this work, like how we want to change these systems. And I think we're really careful, because it is never not top of mind for me that these programs are often the only support families are receiving, right? SNAP is providing people with the resources they need to get food today. And so there's no part of our work that is trying to deny that. We really want to think about how we're improving those systems and improving kind of the overall support folks are getting. And so really just want to, I think we have to hold them both, right? That the systems are necessary and insufficient. And there are plenty, I think the exciting part to me is there's a lot of big picture thinking, and there's also a lot of kind of small technicalities that can really change how people are able to interact with these systems. And I'm glad to be in a community of folks who are thinking about both. Janet?
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if you can talk a bit about benefits for people with disabilities, and I'm not honestly very familiar with them, and what kind of headway you've made in enabling people with disabilities to participate in GI programs.
Absolutely. So the SSI benefits and disability benefits for folks with disabilities are really restrictive. And so you might be familiar with ideas of people can't kind of have high earning jobs because they're going to lose their benefits. Often getting married significantly changes people's access to benefits, and that reality changes how people then structure families and structure their lives. And so again, just a reminder for all of us that these systems like really are changing people's day-to-day choices about their lives. But disability insurance and SSI are kind of two areas where the requirements for participation are really strict, and qualifying for those and proving your need for those is so cumbersome, and rolling off of like losing access to those benefits and having to redo that process can be really tricky, that mostly, I would say up until probably this year, the recommendation was that folks with disabilities, it was too risky. It was not worth it. The benefit you would receive from guaranteed income wasn't worth it. Even like in the amount of, because the other piece of this is the benefit that you're receiving is traditionally higher than some other benefits. And so the guaranteed income, while guaranteed income might cover if you lose SNAP, like the mothers in Jackson, Mississippi, when they lose their kind of SNAP or TANF benefits, the guaranteed income is still making up for that and adding more. And so kind of an overall analysis is that is going to be useful for the time they're in the program and not super harmful post-program, and they'll be able to re-enroll in those benefits. So it's still not equitable because the other people in their cohort who are not receiving those benefits might net $1,000 and they're netting $700. So there's still questions of equity, but in terms of kind of overall financial stability, it didn't feel harmful to participants. On the kind of disability benefit side of things, it's not even often the guaranteed income benefit isn't enough to make up for whatever you might lose while you're in the program. So it's already not kind of a useful program for you to participate in. But then it also, even if that were true, even if you were able to kind of cover the cost of the lost benefit, it is so hard to re-enroll in that system that we had not advised participating because it felt too risky in the long term. Chicago, the city of Chicago. So there's the pilot running in Cook County and one running for the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago was actually able to secure a waiver from the federal government from SSA to exempt that, to kind of protect folks in their program who receive disability benefits. So they've shared that language with us, and that will be we're circulating that with the GICP. It's one of those instances where like we have really good champions on the inside, we have really good advocates on the outside. We were able to kind of protect it, but it names specifically the Chicago pilot. Cook County is in the process of using all the exact same language to make that same request. But again, it's duplicating work among folks like us. And it's also, I think, runs the risk of if anyone in any of those positions changes, would the answer be different? And I think that's not a sustainable, we're very happy to have that benefit. And it means that the city of Chicago's 5,000 participants will include folks who are representative of the broader city. But I think on a policy level, it's a sustainability question. And something we are, I think, really committed to thinking more about. And there's a lot of partners who have led that work that we want to take a lead from on the disability justice side. Jen?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a perfect segue. Can you talk a little bit? I know that you are past your time with us, so very much appreciate you accommodating our questions. So can you talk a little bit about the federal efforts currently underway and how state governments in particular can assist, whether that's engaging with our federal delegation or or other types of associations, thinking about like APHSA, about how we can help elevate that message and what work is already underway?
Absolutely. On the federal side right now, I think our biggest focus is trying to continue pushing for the expanded child tax credit, because we do still see a path to success there. And that, again, like I said, I think that's guaranteed income for households with kids. And that expansion made increased access so significantly for non-white populations. So pre-ARPA expansion, it was, I think, nearly 50% of Black children were not receiving the full child tax credit. And it was maybe 48% of Latinx children were also not receiving the full credit. And then in the fully refundable tax credit, where kind of all of these expansions were in place to increase access and increase the benefit support, we decreased that, and it is now back up very close to where it was before. So I think it's 46% of Black children and maybe 42% of Latinx children, which is unacceptable and is not the point of these benefit systems. So that's one fight where we're really, I think that fight is easiest to talk about because the ask is really clear, and it's put the policy in place that we had in place, that the Biden administration championed, and that we've seen really significant success from. So I think it was 3.7 million children were lifted out of poverty by the CTC alone that last month that it was in place. And child hunger decreased. We have so much evidence. And so I think that's really one federal push that we are trying to make sure all members of the federal delegation understand. I think at the state level, there's also increasing those same benefits. The piece at the federal level that needs to change to make the state level tax credits extra useful is if we can get kind of explicit permissive guidance to say that monthly tax credits wouldn't be counted against people at the state level. So that's a fight that we are kind of gearing up for. And I think one that we're trying to think about really the state administration perspective too, and making sure we're making these asks in coordination and lifting up folks that want to be doing this work. And then I think there's some there's all of these places where the federal government could say, like HUD is a great example of the federal, if HUD wanted to change their rules and regulations, or if Congress wanted to pass legislation, that would be useful. I just don't know that we see, that would kind of solve the problem, but I don't know that we see the political appetite for that yet. And so part of it is helping us build that momentum. And I think that is in kind of all conversations where we're talking about economic justice policy, making sure we're thinking about benefits, access, and equity. And then with federal delegation members, I think for kind of, you all know your federal delegation best, but we need to build champions for this work across delegations, because that's what it's going to take to push some of these federal changes forward. And our the ESP team is very happy and eager to support that work across multiple states and help link states to each other to make those asks a little bit more powerful. So if that's work you all are, I think many of you are already connected to other folks on my team, but I'm happy to make all those connections as well. I do have to run. I'm going to drop my email here just so that you all have it. I am only with ESP for like 2 more weeks. If anyone's coming to our GI Now conference in Atlanta, I will see you there. .org. And kind of, if you have any questions that are specific to me after I leave, the ESP folks will know where to reach me. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and kind of, I'm happy, this is the work I love to do, so I'm happy to have conversations even when I am not kind of as deep in the day-to-day strategy as you all will be. And I'll send around the deck, or I'll send it to James to send around as soon as I can, so that you all have these resources too.
Thanks so much for your time and for fielding our questions and staying over your allotted time. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the work you're doing, and look forward to staying in touch. Bye.
For folks remaining on the call, James has a plug for a conversation happening on Friday.
Yeah, completely coincidentally, this Friday in what normally is our Poverty Relief Task Force, we'll be hearing from our neighbors to the north in the state of Washington and their dismantling poverty effort. And we'll have the senior director in Washington's equivalent of Department of Human Services, Dr. Lori Pfingst, and she's going to be talking about their research into basic income. And so you're all invited to attend that as well. It'll be interesting to get 2 different perspectives in the same week from people from outside our state. So let me know if you are interested. That's my plug.
James, do you have a question? What time on Friday, virtual or in person?
This is virtual and at 10 o'clock. And we will check to make sure that we can record this as well. This meeting that I'm now speaking on still is will be available hopefully early next week is what I would estimate.
James, if people don't have that Friday meeting on their calendar, how do they get invited?
If you can email me, I will be happy to send you the link.
Perfect.
All right, everyone. It's 1 o'clock. Thanks so much. Stay tuned for the next TANF redesign agenda, and we'll hopefully see you on Friday.